you for joining us for this press briefing. My name is Haldane Dodd. I'm the Head of Communications for the Air Transport Action Group. And thank you to IATA for providing your regular press briefing platform for this briefing. Now, the slightly unusual start time for the call of 10 minutes past the hour is because we're in the middle of the Global Sustainable Aviation Forum right now, which is an annual gathering of different parties from across the air transport industry to talk about sustainable development and air transport, particularly around issues to do with climate change, but of course the economic and social benefits of air transport is a big part of the discussions as well. We're going to have a few opening remarks from our Executive Director, Michael Gill, looking at two pieces of information which were shared over the last couple of days. The first is some analysis on the impact of COVID-19 on jobs in the air transport sector, and then also a new report that we released looking at pathways to our long-term climate change goals. We will take questions following that. Please use the chat box to ask questions, and I can direct them to the speakers. And we're very grateful to be joined by the Director General of IATA, Alexandre Juniac, the Director General of ACCAIA, Felipe de Oliveira, and the Chair of the International Coordinating Council for Aerospace Industries Associations, and also Chief Executive of AIA, Eric Fanning. So they will be joining us to answer questions a little later on. But first, I'm going to hand over to our Executive Director, Michael Gill, who will take us through these two reports. Michael, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Haldane, and good afternoon to everybody from the ATAG Global Sustainable Aviation Forum. As Haldane said, we had two significant developments at this year's event, and I'd just like to take a few moments to give you an overview of them. Firstly, we published today the latest version of our Aviation Benefits Beyond Borders report. I'm sure many of you are familiar with previous editions of that. That document, it analyzes the contribution to jobs and GDP of the aviation sector. We updated it naturally this year to take into account the impact of the COVID crisis. And that update makes for fairly sober reading. In terms of traffic numbers, we saw a 94.4% drop in traffic in April of 2020 compared with April of 2019. In April, 64% of the global fleet was grounded. And by the end of this year, we're forecasting a 50% drop in passengers year on year. Moving on to the next slide, how does that translate into jobs? Well, pre-COVID, the ATAG analysis shows that there were 87.7 million jobs supported by the aviation sector on a global basis. 11.3 million of them were directly employed in the aviation sector itself, airlines, airports, manufacturers, and air navigation service providers. And aviation contributes in a normal year $3.5 trillion of economic activity. That's about 4% of global GDP. The update to those figures, taking into account the impact of COVID shows that we will potentially lose 46 million jobs supported by the aviation industry by the end of this year. Direct jobs in aviation, we forecast that 4.8 million jobs will be lost, and the contribution to global GDP will decrease by around 50%. Now, we believe that those jobs will come back once people begin to travel again, but that requires government support in order for us to get there. Moving on to the next slide, there is one positive to come out of the pandemic, and that has been the response that aviation has shown and demonstrated to help deal with the issue. We estimate that 5.4 million citizens have been repatriated by aviation in response to the impact of the COVID crisis on around 40,000 flights. We've seen 1.5 million tons of special cargo being transported by air over the course of the crisis. And perhaps something that Alexandre will want to talk to, we believe, a significant need for airlift capacity going forward once testing and vaccines reach maturity. So those are the highlights of the Aviation Benefits Beyond Borders work. Moving on to the next slide, our second piece of analysis, Waypoint 2050, which we published yesterday, is essentially a look at the pathways to aviation's long-term emissions reductions goal. But again, we've looked at this through the lens of COVID to see how we can use the crisis as an opportunity to supercharge, if you like, aviation sustainability and climate action. We had the very ambitious climate goals set since 2009, which I'm sure you're well aware of. The Waypoint 2050 report shows how we can meet that long-term goal, and it charts a number of different pathways, a number of different scenarios to 2050 and beyond. The overall conclusion shows that our existing target is extremely challenging, but importantly, it is achievable. We also believe that industry at a global level can reach a net zero CO2 emissions target by around 2060 or shortly thereafter. Now, we also recognise and acknowledge that some regions and indeed some individual companies will be able to reach that point earlier. But again, we believe that with appropriate government support and with the right advances in aircraft and engine technology, our existing target and indeed a pathway to net zero emissions is achievable. Some other conclusions from the report, 4 areas where we really need to focus. Sustainable aviation fuel is going to be a huge part of this. We estimate from the analysis that we are going to need a full transition away from fossil fuels with up to 500 million tonnes of sustainable aviation fuel required by 2050. That's up from less than 1 million tonnes being produced today. We also see the need for continuing improvements in conventional aircraft, as well as the research needed to develop electric, hybrid or hydrogen aircraft on a commercial scale by around 2035 to 2040. We believe we need to continue to exploit what is available today as far as operational and infrastructure efficiency improvements are concerned. And our report shows that there will be the need for some form of market-based measure, likely direct air capture or other natural climate solutions to offset any remaining emissions. But I would underline the fact that offsetting is not seen as a central pillar of the industry's long-term action. Finally, our report, turning to the next slide, our report highlights the important role for government as we move forward with our climate action and charting our green recovery. We need governments to de-risk and accelerate the deployment of sustainable aviation fuel all around the world to increase the volumes, increase the level of SAF being used in the aviation supply chain. We believe that governments need to work with industry and research institutions on deploying radical new aircraft and engine technology as we move forward. We also believe that governments need to ensure that existing measures to improve infrastructure such as Single European Sky and next-gen air traffic management in the US are delivered upon. And finally, we believe that in the short term, full application of the ICAO CORSIA mechanism needs to be driven ahead with, and that will also include having more and more countries volunteer for the ICAO CORSIA mechanism to ensure as full a coverage as possible. Howdy, those are the highlights of the reports. Happy to take any questions and answers, and of course both of those are now available on the ATAG website for your review. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michael. And I've put the link into the chat box if anybody wants to download those reports. We'll open up the floor for questions. We probably have about 25 minutes to half an hour. If you've got any questions, please put those into the chat box and we can come around to those. If there are any questions of a particularly technical nature, particularly about some of the technologies that might be needed, we might have to pass those on to some of our colleagues in the manufacturing community community to answer some of those technical questions. But if you have any high-level strategic questions, very happy to take them. I'm going to start with a question that I'll pass on to actually all of the Directors General that we have on the call here. The jobs numbers we've heard are a pretty grim reminder of the impact of COVID-19 and how it's having an effect on air transport. How are airlines, airports and manufacturers responding, and do you think it could actually get worse? So I'm going to ask Eric maybe to tackle that one first, and then we'll pass it over to the others.
Great, thank you, and thanks to ATAG for pulling this summit together, and for all the work that you do. There's no question this is a historic slowdown in air travel. We've never seen anything like this before, and it is having a profound impact on the manufacturing segment, and in particular on the highly skilled and specialized workforce that we have. Fewer passengers, of course, means less demand for our products, and that's everything from aircraft to engines to avionics to maintenance and repair services, and all the way down through a very large and global supply chain. And we are struggling with massive job losses already, as was displayed earlier. And we expect that there will be more furloughs and layoffs on the horizon. There are measures that can help, though, and we're seeing each country take different approaches to this, but in recognition of the critical aspect that aerospace plays in their economies, these governments are offering targeted assistance to support this highly skilled workforce, the companies, and aid the ailing industry, which has to be a priority if we want to move forward to a worldwide recovery when we get past COVID. Despite these challenges, though, industry is still committed to vigorous investments in research and development that can help launch a green recovery from COVID-19 while also enhancing the safety and comfort of flight. And it's extra critically important that governments step up and maintain their commitment to this research and development as well. The aviation aerospace sector is and has always been a dynamic incubator of many cutting-edge technologies. And even in the midst of this pandemic, that important work continues. Manufacturers are using their capabilities and capacity to explore a whole range of innovative technologies that will ensure aviation is on the path to a safer and more sustainable future. And it's now been over a decade that we've been working through ATAG to make sure that these efforts are coordinated and effective. We're also collaborating on research and development efforts across countries to make sure they are aligned to meeting the ambitious goals we've set for ourselves as an industry, and working together on how we can support airlines to renew their fleets once they return to growth, recognizing, of course, that each generation of technology is more efficient than the previous. And so while there is no one answer or no silver bullet to this crisis, it's going to be collaboration, partnerships, and a shared commitment to recovery that form the basis for the keys to success for our shared ecosystem. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Eric, for that. Maybe, Alexandre, can I pass over to you just to have a quick view on how airlines are responding and whether you think it could get worse than what we're seeing at the moment?
Yeah, thank you very much. As you know, and as my predecessor just said, it's an unprecedented crisis. We see the economic consequences that are absolutely dramatic, particularly in terms of restructuring, layoff, and a drop of revenues and potential bankruptcies. So it's a crisis whose order of magnitude is unknown. It is very likely that this crisis will last at least until we have something very strong as treatment or vaccine for this pandemic. So what we need is the extension of government support, similar to what we have known in the first part of the crisis. So regulatory relief, cost reduction, financial support and intervention from government, cash injection. That's absolutely key. We will probably rely on more government support in the coming month to help us to survive. It's a matter of financial survival, and we need financial support from government. The second point on which we need significant positive measures from government is to reopen borders and to relaunch air travel. Up to now, what has been the main obstacle to the air traffic recovery are the traffic restrictions and mainly the quarantine measures and border closures of any kind. So we are asking government to remove these traffic restrictions and these quarantines and to replace these measures by a system of systematic testing for passengers at departure to avoid maintaining these restrictions that are a complete blocking point on air travel. So here we need a strong government policy, collaborative, within ICAO or within any international framework to implement common standards that would reopen borders, allow them to remove border closure or travel restrictions and quarantine measures, and adopt a single system that would be applicable everywhere, and that would be based, it's our proposal, on a systematic testing for passenger departure using the new test provided by the industry. So that is how we see the situation. No improvement in the near future. We have published just yesterday our last outlook, and you see that our forecast is more pessimistic than it was only a few weeks ago. The traffic should decline by more than 60%, something like 63%. We were in a decline around 55% just 8 or 9 weeks ago. So we think that, unfortunately, the situation is not going to improve in the short run.
Okay, thank you, Alexandre. Luis Felipe, maybe a view from the airports side as well, and whether you're seeing the same lack of continuing growth.
Thank you, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I echo the voices of Eric and Alexandre regarding the global crisis, this unprecedented crisis that you are facing. The airports represent around 6% of the jobs and supporting local economies in the locations that we serve. And of course, we are heavily affected in terms of the pandemic, that we are losing around 5 billion passengers on 2020, around 60%, very similar with the number that Alexandre presents. And that will be a reduction of $104 billion in less revenues for the airports as well. Just to mention that the airports, around 70% of the airports globally were not making any money before the crisis. And that's, of course, affected us a lot in terms that we need to continue to be open to serve the flights, to serve especially the cargo flights and also the humanitarian flights. And to keep the structure open, you need to keep a certain level of passengers, the employees working on the industry. For that reason, I'd like to raise 2 points that is very similar to my colleagues. One is the government support. Airports so far is not receiving any kind of support except for certain specific countries. And any kind of relief will be very helpful to continue our operations globally. And I echo the voice of Alexandre in terms of the tests. And we believe that the coordinating tests on international passengers based on internationally and accepted protocols on the risk-based and resource-effective approach will be enabled to reduce the quarantine requirements and, of course, the border closures. The effective working from the organizations that we are here representing, together with the governments, together with ICAO, will be a key element on this recovery process. And we don't see, unfortunately, a short-term solution for the crisis that we are facing now.
Okay, thank you, Luis Felipe. So we've got another question here, a quick one for Michael. Perhaps, what do you expect industry CO2 emissions will now be in 2020?
Thanks, Alden. We, in line with the drop in traffic, we see a forecast of emissions down 60% on 2019 levels. In 2019, emissions from international and domestic aviation were just over 900 million tonnes.
Okay, thank you. One that I'll open up perhaps to Eric is how do you think the industry is going to achieve its emissions targets and really become sustainable against the current downturn?
Well, I think we have, we're still committed to the ambitious goals we set for 2050, and those goals, it's worth noting, do not include offsets. And I think in the earlier presentation, it's a combination of technologies, many different types of technologies that different companies are exploring, which is good. The more competition on this, the more likely we'll reach those ambitious goals. But a critical element of that, while we're developing these new technologies, is going to be the sustainable aviation fuel that was mentioned in the briefing earlier. That has to be ramped up substantially, which is going to require not just industry, but also government, and not just the aviation industry. It's also going to require support from the energy and finance industries in order to meet these goals.
Excellent, thanks. Another question here, should governments be using the crisis to make aviation more sustainable? In other words, should they be taxing airlines, avoiding support for airports in order to reduce traffic levels? Perhaps can I start, Alexandre, with you? Thoughts on that?
Definitely not. So I think that the crisis is so deep and so difficult that the government shouldn't have an additional burden on our shoulders, first of all. Secondly, if we had given up our targets on environment and particularly on the CO2 reduction, CO2 emission reduction, we could have understood the policy for government to oblige us to meet our obligation, but it's not the case. We are still committed. We will make it. So there is no need for any government intervention, especially through taxes, which puts an additional cost on a sector which is, as I told you, dramatically hit by this crisis, and which is struggling for its survival.
Thank you. Michael, did you have a thought on that question?
Yeah, just to add to that, clearly from our perspective for governments, rather than focusing on taxation or other measures which is going to cost the industry even further, this is an opportunity to throw all their weight behind supporting SAF production. Or investment into R&D in new technologies. That really has to be the focus now, because it shows a long-term vision for a sector rather than short-term regulatory punitive measures.
Maybe just explain SAF.
Sorry, SAF is sustainable aviation fuel. This is a fuel made from non-fossil-based sources. There are now 7 approved pathways, 7 approved methods by which SAF can be produced. The environmental impact of it is that over the production life cycle of a sustainable aviation fuel, it produces anything up to 80% less CO2 emissions than conventional jet fuel.
Okay, thank you. One question here about the impact of COVID-19 on the jobs. We heard this before, that it's how massive it is. How much worse do you think it will get if there's no recovery in 2021? Maybe Luis Felipe, a question for you.
Aviation is really crucial for the global economy. That's why everything that affects aviation will affect the global economy at all, especially the countries that are heavily dependent on tourism. And of course, we represent around 10% of the global economy in terms of the jobs and in terms of the aviation, the economy as well. That's why the impact that will continue in 2021 will be a tough year for all of us. But I truly believe that aviation is a key sector that must recover. And as I mentioned before, with the joint efforts from the organizations, governments, and ICCAIA, I think we believe that you can go back on track in the future years. However, 2021 will be a tough year for all of us, and I truly believe that it will be probably the worst year of aviation, considering the recovery process that you need to pass through.
Okay, and maybe Alexandre, have you got any thoughts on next year, or is it all just dealing with this year so far?
For the moment, we have not published anything on next year. We are, because the uncertainty is too high, particularly the attitude of governments regarding opening or not opening borders, which is a key factor for recovery or blocking the recovery. So, but we are not totally over optimistic, to say the least.
Okay. A question about the net zero that is mentioned in the Waypoint 2050 report. Maybe this is a question for Michael. Why 2060 instead of 2050, which has already been agreed to by some airlines? Shouldn't it be more ambitious?
Yeah, thanks, Haldane. What our report concludes is that 2060 is an achievable endpoint for net zero emissions on a global level, taking into account the entire sector all across the world. The pledges that we've seen have been taken either on a regional, national basis or by individual companies. Now, we also recognize it's possible for some parts of the world to get to that point sooner. What we believe is that the analysis we've published is a pragmatic vision of where we are able to get to. It's a realistic vision of where we can get to with the right level of government support and at a global level. It's really important to underline that.
Okay, thank you. There's been a question specific to India and the impact on job losses within India. We haven't actually published any specific analysis on a country-by-country basis, but we have on a regional basis. However, I think the first part of the question's interesting, and I'll open it up to the three directors general, actually, to think about the impact of the shutdown in aviation on the indirect and the induced jobs, the wider jobs in the economy. Any thoughts, perhaps starting with Luis Felipe, on construction and airports and things like that, how the flow-on effect has an impact?
Thank you, Aldan. As I mentioned before, the airports represent around 60% of the aviation jobs, considering all the industries and all the related companies that work inside of the airports. Of course, without passengers, we don't have the movement of the passengers inside the airports. We don't have people buying in the free shops. We don't have the ground handling. We don't have the service on fuel. We don't have any kind of service that provide to the passengers and the airport and airlines at the airports. And of course, that affects us a lot. We expect to have around 50% of reduction in the jobs in the industry, considering the year of 2020. And if the crisis continues, probably these numbers goes even further.
Thank you. And Eric, perhaps from the manufacturing side as well, obviously manufacturers have a very long tail of supply chain throughout the economy. Any thoughts on that?
Well, first I would just reflect back to one of the slides in your presentation so that we all remember, and we said it as well, how big of an economic engine air travel is. And so the impact is far and wide. On the manufacturing side, we have a couple of issues, I think. Certainly, if there's no recovery next year, we're going to have more job losses. And that impacts a very highly skilled, highly trained workforce that is very hard to get back once you lose it. So it's not just the number of jobs, it's the type of jobs, and it's the investment and time it would take to get them back once there is a recovery. And of course, as you mentioned, the industry is built on thousands and thousands of companies in a global supply chain, large companies to very small companies, family-owned companies, minority-owned companies. And that's an ecosystem that's also hard to get back once you lose it. And for many of us on the call, for many of the countries involved in commercial civil aviation manufacturing, that supply chain also backs up national security because it's a shared supply chain on the defense side. So we're talking about companies workforce skills that are very hard to rebuild if lost.
Okay, that's a good point. Thank you. The next question I'm going to pass to Alexandre. It's a question from Paul Sillers. The flights that are operating at the moment involve passengers wearing masks, crew in COVID-19 protective suits, etc. When do you think that the passenger experience will get back to normal? And how can airlines use sustainability, do you think, as a focal point in returning to that normal?
What we can anticipate is that passenger journey and experience should go back to normal when there will be a significant improvement either in vaccine or in treatment. So when the risk of being infected or of infection transmission between countries or location is significantly reduced. So it's not before month and month from now.
Exactly. Okay, we've got time, I think, for two last questions. The first one, and maybe Alexandre, you already answered this, but how long do you think it's going to take to restore the damage that's been caused? We saw the graph on Michael's slide earlier of losing potentially 14, 15 years worth of growth. How long will it take to restore that damage? Alexandre, for you?
To restore the damage is a difficult question. What we have in our long-term forecast is that we should catch up with the 2019 figures by the end of 2023, beginning of 2024. Well, we will catch up. Now, to restore and compensate, the losses or to bridge the gap we have faced during this period, it will take probably an additional 2 to 3 years to overcompensate and to restore the financial economic health of the industry. So we'll have lost 6, 7, 8 years.
Okay. Last question we've got here, and it's about aviation and as an employer. It's been an attractive employer over the last few years. How difficult do you think it's going to be to attract talent once the demand for flying returns? Are people going to be scared off, considering the job losses that we're seeing now in the next few months? Maybe, Eric, can I pass to you, and then the other two Directors General?
I don't think it will be hard to attract talent inside the manufacturing segment. The issue is it's hard to find that talent already. And as I said earlier, it's a highly skilled, highly trained workforce. And so it's not just a matter of attracting it, it's finding it and then investing the time and training in it, which is the main reason that the support we have sought from governments globally is really focused on maintaining our workforce through this crisis.
Luis Felipe, have you got any thoughts on attracting talent when we recover?
Yes, I believe that is the sustainability part will play a big role as well. Considering that we need to change a little bit our modus operandi in terms of how we can reach sustainable and viable industry in the future, and of course that will attract maybe the new generation that is looking for a better world in the future, and together with us will be an opportunity to provide jobs and opportunities in the airport side as well. In addition, I truly believe that we are really a global industry, and as a global industry we have a lot of attractions that any other jobs have, and that will bring us back on track, attracting the right and the good talents to the industry as we need it.
Thanks. And Alexandre, do you have any concerns in the long term about attracting people to aviation?
I'm not very concerned because I think we are still an industry which is attractive. We are in a difficult time, but we are still, making people dream. It's also a very attractive industry because it's global, as Luis mentioned. There's also a point I would like to mention. It's an industry in which the spectrum of qualification is very broad. So you employ very highly skilled engineers or pilots, but also a slightly low skill of people in other jobs. So we offer complete potential of different jobs for everyone, and that is unique, I think. and very attractive in many parts of the world. So I'm not very worried.
Okay, well, excellent. Thank you very much, Alexandre, Luis Felipe, and Eric, and also Michael for joining us. We have to wrap up here. Thank you for your questions. If you have any further questions on some of the technical aspects, then feel free to get in touch with the communications teams at IATA or AIA or ACI, or indeed myself at ATAG. But in the meantime, thank you all for joining us, and have a good afternoon.